Hello, my YouTube family and young listeners. I'm Crime Whisper, and I know many of you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, so before you drift off, I'd love to know where in the world are you tuning in from tonight. Drop it in the comments below, and if you're enjoying the case, don't forget to like and subscribe now. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. Why in the quiet city of Weatherford, Texas, lived the Kaler family. James Craig Kaler, known simply as Craig, his wife Karen, their daughters Emily and Lauren, and their young son Sean, to neighbors. They were the perfect family. Craig and Karen had met in college. He was wrapping up his engineering degree at Kansas State, while she was just beginning her studies, smart, ambitious, and deeply in love. They were the couple everyone admired after graduation. They married, welcomed their first daughter Emily, and by 1999, Craig had landed a prestigious position as Weatherford's utility director. The job paid well and carried respect, allowing them to settle into a comfortable home where they soon welcomed two more children, Lauren and Sean, from the outside. The Kalers seemed picture perfect. Emily went on to attend St. Louis College of Pharmacy. Lauren was an honor student and musician, and the family was well loved in their community. Karen was known for baking treats and welcoming neighbors with warmth. While the girls often performed music around town, people described them as the all-American family, but behind closed doors, things were very different. Karen eventually confided in her sister Lynn that Craig had become increasingly controlling over the years. He gave her curfews, limited her to an allowance, demanded receipts for every purchase, even groceries, and insisted on intimacy. Every night at exactly 8 p.m., life at home was ruled by his strict routines, leaving Karen feeling trapped and powerless. Seeking freedom, she joined a local gym during school hours while Craig was at work. What began as a hobby soon became a passion, and before long, she was working there as a fitness instructor. To her surprise, Craig didn't object so long as she remained home in time for the children. It was at that gym that Karen met Sonny Ree, another trainer. They clicked instantly, and soon their friendship grew into a romantic affair. Karen, worn down by years of control, felt genuinely cared for by Sonny. Eventually, she confessed the relationship to Craig, expecting anger, but instead, Craig shocked her by approving. Not only did he support it, he reached out to Sonny himself, even sending her flowers and suggesting a threesome. Karen and Sonny, however, wanted nothing to do with that arrangement. They simply wanted each other. This rejection humiliated Craig, realizing Sonny would never be part of his marriage. He demanded Karen end the affair, but she refused, and the relationship continued. Seeing his family slipping away, Craig came up with a plan. He would move them far from Weatherford and start fresh soon. He secured a new position in Columbia, Missouri. One, he believed, would give him the chance to break Karen and Sonny apart once and for all. The move to Missouri. By 2008, Craig Kaler had managed to become the highest paid employee in the city of Columbia, Missouri. To him, the move wasn't just about career advancement. It was strategy. He wanted distance between Karen and Sonny. Nearly 700 miles of it, he believed, perhaps naively, that pulling up roots and transplanting the family would cut the affair off at its source. But, as so often happens in stories like this, distance didn't kill the relationship, it deepened it. Karen and Sonny found ways to keep the spark alive. There were phone calls at odd hours, long email threads filled with longing, and text messages exchanged daily. Every so often, they would arrange to meet halfway between Missouri and Texas, sneaking away for stolen hours or a weekend together. They clung to one another, despite the obstacles. For Craig, this was infuriating. His plan had failed. What he had hoped would be a fresh start quickly soured into something far worse: resentment, paranoia, and escalating rage. The New Year's party, that same winter, the Kalers returned to Weatherford for New Year's Eve. Friends and neighbors hosted a festive gathering, and for a while, it seemed like old times. But among the guests was Sonny, and Karen's affection toward her could no longer be hidden. Multiple people at the party later recalled how obvious it was. Whispers exchanged glances, lingering touches. The secret was out in public now. No longer something only the three of them knew for Craig. It was humiliation in the purest form. His wife's betrayal was no longer whispered behind closed doors. It was displayed in front of friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. He felt mocked, exposed, diminished in the way home. His anger erupted. Witnesses said Karen appeared shaken and bruised, claiming Craig had shoved her so hard that her head struck the pavement. The night ended in violence, and the marriage already fractured was shattered beyond repair. Divorce proceedings. In the days that followed, Karen finally made her decision. She told Craig she was filing for divorce. Legal paperwork was set in motion. She moved into a spare bedroom, and eventually out of the home, completely. Craig reacted by frantically calling Karen's family and friends. One day, he begged them to talk sense into her, claiming she was just confused. The next, he lashed out, insisting she was abandoning him for another woman, plotting to drain him of money, and ripping the children from his life. Evan, Sonny began speaking directly to Craig, urging him to stop harassing Karen and let her go. She reminded him that Karen had never been happy under his control, and that this wasn't about money or schemes, it was about freedom. But Craig could not accept it. His identity, his pride, his sense of control, it was all unraveling. Escalation and arrest. By March 2009, matters turned physical again. A heated argument spiraled into violence. Craig later told police he had simply hugged Karen tightly, that she resisted, but meant no harm. Karen's account was chillingly different. She said he had grabbed her so violently it left bruises. She provided a written statement. Over time, it has become apparent that Craig is controlling. I have learned that he is capable of using force. The issues vary, but I figured out how to keep things from becoming ugly. When money was a problem, I hid prices. When it was about sex, I decided it was easier to give him what he wanted every night than to refuse on occasions. When I did refuse, he has been forceful and mean. I'm afraid it will escalate so far that someone is going to be seriously hurt with those words. She pressed charges and moved out with the children for Craig. This was the ultimate betrayal. He grew increasingly unstable, angry, unpredictable. He disowned his daughters, Emily and Lauren, calling them rotting corpses for siding with their mother and accepting Sonny. He fixated only on his son, Sean, whom he viewed as his last loyal bond. His behavior escalated into stalking. He installed hidden cameras in the house, hacked into Karen's emails, and slashed her car tires. Police were called repeatedly. Craig seemed consumed, unable to let go. Cracks in his career. Meanwhile, Craig's once respected career began to collapse at work. His colleagues noticed troubling behavior, showing family photo albums repeatedly, leaving the office without warning to check on Karen, slipping away from responsibilities. His manager, Bill, recognized the decline quietly. He pulled Craig aside and urged him to resign. In September 2009, Craig was paid out with 2 months' salary and a month of severance for the first time in years. He was unemployed and directionless. He retreated to his parents' home, seething, and though separated, he still owed Karen more than $3,000 a month in child support, a financial strain that only deepened his bitterness. Thanksgiving 2009, the holiday season brought no relief that year. Karen, the girls, and Sonny spent Thanksgiving at Lynn's house. 10-year-old Sean, however, was with Craig. Karen still wanted all her children together, so she planned to visit her grandmother Dorothy's farmhouse in rural Berlin, Kansas. At 89 years old, Dorothy lived a quiet, peaceful life in a town of fewer than 1,000 people. Karen hoped the visit would bring some joy, a sense of normalcy amid the chaos of divorce proceedings. Despite everything, court battles, financial disputes, and the tug-of-war over custody, she remained optimistic that an eventual resolution was possible. But for Craig, hope had already died inside him. Was a storm that had been brewing for years, and soon it would erupt in a way no one could have imagined. The perfect family. Imogen, Weatherford, Texas. The Kaler family were admired by almost everyone who knew them. James Craig, Kaler, known to friends simply as Craig, lived there with his wife, Karen, and their 3 children, Emily, the eldest, Lauren, their middle daughter, and young Sean, their only son from the outside. The Kalers seemed to have it all. Craig and Karen's love story began back in college. Craig was completing his final year of engineering at Kansas State University. While Karen was just starting out, they were both intelligent, ambitious, and attractive. Friends remembered them as the golden couple on campus. The pair everyone thought would go far in life, and in many ways, they did. After graduating, they quickly married and started their family. Their eldest daughter, Emily, arrived, followed a few years later by Lauren, and finally, their youngest child. Sean. Craig soon landed a highly respected job as the director of utilities. In Weatherford, the position paid handsomely, offered stability, and gave Craig a respected title in the community. The family bought a lovely home and seemed to embody everything people thought of when they imagined the American dream. Karen was described as warm and generous, always baking cakes and welcoming. New neighbors. Emily went off to study pharmacy in St. Louis. While Lauren excelled in high school both academically and musically, she and Emily even formed a small band, performing in town and earning admiration from their peers. 10-year-old Sean was still the baby of the family, cheerful and close to both parents to outsiders. The Kalers looked picture perfect, the kind of family you might see on the cover of a magazine, but behind the doors of their home, cracks had already started to form. Control. Behind closed doors, Kern's sister, Lynn, later revealed that the marriage was far from the idyllic picture everyone believed over the years. Craig's behavior became increasingly controlling. He monitored Karen's spending, gave her allowances, and demanded receipts for every purchase, even groceries. He expected dinner at precise times, household chores to be timed, and sexual intimacy scheduled every night at exactly 8 p.m. Confided to Lynn that she felt trapped. She tried to keep the peace, following Craig's rules to avoid conflict, but she felt her independence slipping away. She longed for something that belonged only to her. Outlet came in the form of a gym membership. Karen began going while the children were at school, and Craig was at work. Exercise gave her a new sense of freedom. Before long, she became such a regular that she was offered a job as a fitness instructor. It was a completely different path than she had ever envisioned, but it made her feel alive at the gym. She met another trainer, Eerie, from their first encounter. The two bonded quickly. Their friendship deepened, and eventually it crossed into romance for Karen, who had endured years of control. Sunny represented kindness, care, and freedom. The relationship blossomed into a full-blown affair. Craig's shocking response when Karen finally confessed the affair to Craig. She braced for his anger instead. She was met with something stranger. Craig told her he was fine with it so long as he could be part of it. He even reached out to Sunny, sending her flowers, and suggested they form a threesome to spice up their marriage. But Karen and Sunny wanted no part of that. Their relationship was theirs alone. When Craig realized he could not control it, he grew humiliated and desperate. He insisted Karen end it, but she refused, believing the only solution was a fresh start. Craig looked for a new job far away. In 2008, he secured a high-paying position in Columbia, Missouri, making him the city's highest-paid employee. The family uprooted their lives and moved nearly 700 miles away. Craig was convinced distance would kill the affair, but it didn't. Distance only deepened the affair. Despite the miles between them, Karen and Sunny remained close. They exchanged constant phone calls, emails, and texts whenever possible. They met halfway, sneaking away for weekends together. The physical distance seemed only to intensify their bond. Craig realized his plan had failed. His rage simmered beneath the surface, fed by paranoia and wounded pride. The breaking point came that winter, when the family returned to Weatherford for a New Year's Eve party. New Year's Eve humiliation. The Kalers attended the party with many neighbors and old friends. Sunny was there as well. Throughout the night, multiple guests noticed Karen and Sunny together, whispering, smiling, sharing subtle touches. What had once been secret was now painfully obvious for Craig. The humiliation was unbearable. His wife's betrayal was no longer private. It was on display for everyone to see on the drive home. His fury boiled over. Witnesses later said Karen appeared battered and shaken, telling friends that Craig had shoved her so violently she struck her head on the street. The incident was a turning point days later. Karen told Craig she was filing for divorce. She started the paperwork, moved into a separate room, and soon moved out of the family home. Entire Craig's reaction was frantic and unstable. He spent hours calling Karen's family and friends, alternating between begging them to convince her to stay and angrily accusing her of plotting to steal his money and children. Sunny herself contacted Craig, telling him to leave Karen alone, but Craig couldn't accept it. His control was slipping through his fingers, and the thought of losing Karen pushed him deeper into rage. By March 2009, tensions escalated again. Another argument turned physical. Craig told police he had simply hugged Karen tightly, but she reported that he had grabbed her so violently it left bruises. She filed a chilling written statement describing years of coercion and control, confessing that she gave in to his demands to avoid violence, but feared one day he would seriously hurt her. She pressed charges. She and the children moved out. Completely isolation and obsession from that point. Craig's world unraveled. He became increasingly reclusive. He rejected his daughters outright, furious that they supported their mother and even accepted Sunny. He only wanted to see his son Sean, whom he viewed as his last remaining ally. He began calling Emily and Lauren rotting corpses, dead to him for siding with Karen. His obsession grew darker. He stalked Karen, sneaking into the house to install hidden cameras and hacking into her emails. He slashed her car tires and ripped cables from the outside of her home. Police were called repeatedly at work. Craig's behavior deteriorated as well. Colleagues noticed him showing family photo albums again and again, leaving abruptly to check on Karen, and neglecting his duties. In September 2009, his manager quietly asked him to resign. He was paid out with severance, but his career was effectively over now. Unemployed, humiliated, and consumed by anger, Craig moved back in with his parents, legally separated. He still owed Karen more than $3,000 a month in child support, an obligation that ate away at him. Thanksgiving 2009, as the holidays approached, Karen and her daughters spent Thanksgiving with her sister Lynn, along with Sonny. Sean, however, spent the holiday with Craig. The next day, Karen planned a trip to visit her grandmother Dorothy in Berlin, Kansas, a quiet farmhouse in a town of fewer than 1,000 people. Dorothy was 89, and Karen wanted to bring all her children together for the visit, along with Sonny. Despite the tension of the divorce, the custody battles, and the financial struggles, Karen remained hopeful. She believed the resolution was still possible. She was wrong. Craig's breaking point. By late 2009, Craig had lost everything he valued: his job, his marriage, his reputation, his authority over his family and his mind. Karen and Sonny had humiliated him, his daughters had betrayed him, and even the courts were siding against him. The pressure built like a storm inside him, and he began voicing disturbing thoughts. Friends recalled him referring to his daughters as corpses, muttering about betrayal, and hinting at vengeance. He became convinced that his family had turned against him, except for Sean. To him, Sean was pure, uncorrupted, the only one who hadn't abandoned him. That belief soon twisted into something horrifying. The night of violence in June 22, 2009. Craig put his plan into action. He armed himself and drove to the home where Karen and the children were staying. What happened next was described in court as one of the most brutal family crimes in Missouri history. Karen was shot multiple times at close range. Emily and Lauren, just teenagers, were also gunned down. Each life was extinguished in a storm of bullets. When the gunfire stopped, Craig stood over their bodies. The only one left alive was 10-year-old Sean. Instead of harming him, Craig took him and fled. The attack shocked everyone who knew the family, neighbors who had once admired the Kahlers as the picture of success now watched in disbelief as the truth unraveled. The arrest it didn't take long for police to identify Craig as the suspect. His obsession, his threats, his unraveling behavior all pointed directly to him. An arrest warrant was issued, and Craig was eventually taken into custody. In interviews, he showed little remorse. He claimed he had been provoked, humiliated, betrayed. He cast himself as the victim, even after murdering his wife and 2 daughters for Sean. The trauma was unimaginable. He had witnessed the destruction of his family, left with the weight of his father's actions for the rest of his life. Aftermath: the Kaler murders left the community stunned. Neighbors who once looked up to the family as role models were left grappling with grief and horror. The image of perfection had been shattered, revealing years of control, abuse, and obsession beneath the surface. Karen's sister Lynn, who had long worried about her, now lived with the pain of knowing Karen's fears had come true, that Craig's violence had escalated to the point of no return. In court, Craig was convicted and sentenced, but no sentence could undo what had been lost: a mother and 2 young women. Their lives cut short, their futures stolen. Reflection: the tragedy of the Kaler family is a chilling reminder of how appearances can deceive from the outside. They seemed like the perfect family, but control, abuse, and obsession eroded them from within until the facade crumbled in violence. Karen once wrote that she feared Craig would escalate to the point where someone was seriously hurt. Her words turned out to be prophetic. And perhaps the saddest part of all is Sean, just 10 years old, left to carry the burden of that night and the legacy of what his father did. The trial of Craig Kaler. As arrest, Craig Kaler was brought before the court to face the consequences of his actions. The charges were devastating: the murders of his wife Karen and their 2 daughters, Emily and Lauren, as well as kidnapping his young son Sean. From the very beginning, Craig tried to cast himself as a man driven to the edge. His defense team painted him as someone who had been humiliated, betrayed, and emotionally broken by his wife's affair. They claimed he snapped in a moment of overwhelming stress, but the prosecution told a different story, one built not on sudden impulse, but on years of control, obsession, and planning. They presented the evidence of Craig's stalking, his installation of cameras, his hacking into Karen's emails, his slashing of her tires, and his long history of abuse. They read aloud Karen's haunting statement to police, where she warned she feared he would escalate until someone was seriously hurt. Those words echoed through the courtroom like a prophecy fulfilled. Testimonies: family and friends took the stand, their voices heavy with grief. Karen's sister Lynn recounted how Karen had confided in her, describing Craig's rules, his demands, his suffocating control. Lynn told the jury that Karen had wanted nothing more than to find her independence, her freedom, and her happiness with sunny neighbors. Recalled seeing Craig's anger firsthand. Some remembered the New Year's Eve party, the tension between Craig and Karen, and the way he seemed consumed with humiliation. Others testified to his paranoia, his obsession with showing photo albums, and his refusal to accept reality. Perhaps the most heartbreaking moments came when the surviving family members spoke about Emily and Lauren, their talents, their dreams, their lives cut tragically short. Emily, the pharmacy student who wanted to dedicate her life to helping others. Lauren, the honor student and musician whose bright future was stolen. And then there was Sean, the little boy who had lived through it all, too young to testify fully. His role in the case was silent but overwhelming. He was the child who had lost his mother and sisters in one night, and who now carried the unbearable knowledge of what his father had done. Psychological profile experts were brought in to analyze Craig's mental state. Psychologists described him as a man with extreme narcissistic tendencies, someone who viewed his family not as individuals with their own desires, but as extensions of himself. When Karen sought independence, he saw it not as a natural evolution of a long marriage, but as a betrayal of his control, his need to dominate every aspect of her life. Her money, her time, even her body fit a pattern of coercive control, common in abusive relationships. And when that control slipped away, his response wasn't grief, was rage. His obsession with humiliation his labeling of his daughters as rotting corpses, his fixation on Sean as his last loyal ally, all pointed to a man whose ego could not survive rejection. The experts agreed. Craig hadn't simply snapped in one moment of madness. He had been building toward violence for years. The verdict, weeks of testimony. The jury reached its conclusion. Craig Kaler was found guilty on all counts in sentencing. The judge did not hold back. He described Craig's crimes as the ultimate act of selfishness, a destruction of life motivated not by love or despair, but by control and pride. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for some. The sentence brought a measure of relief for others. No punishment could ever truly balance the scales for the lives lost. Life after the murders. The aftermath of the murders rippled far beyond the courtroom. Sean, just 10 years old at the time, was placed in the care of relatives. He grew up with the shadow of that night forever hanging over him, the knowledge that his father had murdered his mother and sisters, yet spared him. Some believe Craig saw Sean as his legacy, the only one he hadn't lost. But to Sean, that so-called mercy was a burden too heavy to carry. Sunni, the woman Karen had fallen in love with, was left devastated. Not only had she lost her partner, but she had also become a target for whispers and blame. Some outsiders cruelly suggested she was the reason for the tragedy. But those who knew the truth understood this wasn't about Sunny. This was about Craig, his obsession, and his inability to accept that Karen deserved a life outside his control. The community in Weatherford, and later Columbia, struggled with disbelief. How could the family they once admired as the picture of success end in such violence? Neighbors who had once eaten Karen's cakes, who had clapped for Emily and Lauren's band performances, were left with empty streets and a house that became a monument to tragedy, legacy, and reflection. Years later, the story of the Kaler family continues to serve as a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked control and obsession. Karen had tried to warn those around her. She had told police she feared it would escalate. She had confided in her sister about Craig's tightening grip, and yet, even with those warnings, no one could have predicted the sheer brutality of that night. Control, abuse, and obsession often hide behind closed doors. From the outside, everything looked perfect: successful careers, talented children, a warm and welcoming household. But perfection was only a mask, hiding years of fear. The Kaler case reminds us that appearances can deceive, that behind the image of the all-American family, darkness can lurk on the outside. The Kaler family looked like everything a small-town community could admire. They lived in Weatherford, Texas, in a neat 2-story house, with a trimmed lawn and a warmth that drew neighbors. In Craig Kaler, the father was a proud man. He held a good job in insurance, wore pressed shirts, and liked to be seen as the provider who always had things under control. Control, that word would become important. Later his wife, Karen, was different. Where Craig was rigid, Karen was gentle. She had an easy smile and a kindness that people never forgot. She baked cakes for neighbors, volunteered at her daughter's school, and carried herself with a grace that made people naturally trust her. Together, they had 3 children. Emily, their oldest, was a young woman already walking her own path. She was in pharmacy school, studying late into the night, determined to make something of herself. Lauren, their middle child, was still in high school. She played music, earned top grades, and had the kind of bright future that made teachers proud. And then there was Sean, the youngest, just a boy, still innocent, still clinging to childhood. His world was video games, cartoons, and the safety of his mother's arms. To anyone looking in from the outside, this was the picture of success: a strong father, a loving mother, talented children, and a home filled with laughter. Friends and neighbors would later say they seemed like the perfect family, the kind of family others quietly envied. But perfection has a way of hiding cracks in behind closed doors. Those cracks were already forming. Craig's pride wasn't just pride, it was control. He liked things done his way: the money, the schedules, the rules. He expected obedience, not discussion. For years, Karen went along, quietly keeping the peace. But deep inside, she carried a truth she could not ignore. Her marriage was suffocating her still. No one on the outside could see that. They only saw the surface, the friendly waves at the mailbox, the family photos with wide smiles, the sound of children practicing piano or laughing in the backyard. It was, in every sense, the perfect family, but perfection, my friends, is often the most fragile mask of all. Part 2. Cracks beneath the surface. By the mid-2000s, the mask of perfection in the Kaler home was starting to slip. Craig, once the charming husband neighbors admired, had begun to show another side of himself behind closed doors. His need for control grew sharper. He was the kind of man who noticed every dollar spent, every minute late, every detail out of place, and Karen had learned to bend. She managed her husband the way someone might manage a storm, carefully, cautiously, with the hope of avoiding damage. If groceries were too expensive, she hid the receipts. If Craig wanted intimacy, she gave in, even when her heart wasn't in it, because saying no often meant enduring anger, or worse, to outsiders. Karen still seemed gentle, patient, warm, but inside, she was quietly breaking. Her daughters noticed the tension before anyone else. Emily, busy with her pharmacy studies, tried to stay out of it, though she carried a protective streak for her mother. Lauren, younger but sharp, had saw more than her father realized: the arguments, the slammed doors, the silence that followed. And Sean, too young to fully understand, only sensed that something in the air didn't feel safe anymore. Then came Sunny. Sunny was different, independent, outgoing, and bold in ways Karen had never allowed herself to be. They first crossed paths casually through mutual friends, community events, the small-town circles where everyone eventually meets. At first, their friendship seemed innocent. Long talks, laughter, little escapes from reality. But the more time Karen spent with Sunny, the more she realized what she'd been missing: freedom, warmth, someone who saw her not as a wife to be controlled, but as a woman with dreams and feelings of her own. For Craig, this shift was devastating. He didn't yet know the full truth, but he felt that Karen was pulling away, her attention elsewhere, and Craig, who lived for control, was terrified of losing. At gatherings, neighbors noticed subtle changes. Karen smiled more when Sunny was around. Sunny looked at Karen in a way that was hard to miss. And Craig's face carried a shadow of anger. He tried to disguise the whispers. Started nothing loud, just passing remarks at church, quiet speculation in the grocery store. People wondered if something was going on, but no one dared to say it outright inside the Kaler household. Though the tension was no longer whisper sit was war. Arguments stretched late into the night. Accusations were thrown, followed by icy silences, and Karen, who once smoothed over every rough edge, stopped pretending she was done hiding. By the time Craig accepted a higher-paying job in a nearby city and moved his family there in 2008, he hoped distance would solve the problem. Sunny and Karen would be nearly 700 meters apart now. Surely the affair, if it even was an affair, would fade. But love, especially forbidden love, doesn't fade that easily. The cracks in the Kaler family were no longer invisible. They were growing, spreading, deepening with every secret phone call, every hidden text, every stolen glance between Karen and Sunny. And soon those cracks would shatter everything. Part 3. The affair in the open. By 2008, Craig's world was unraveling. He could feel it in his bones. His grip on the family was slipping. Karen had changed. She still cooked dinner, still folded laundry, still wore the smile she showed her children, but it wasn't the same. Her laughter no longer belonged to him. Her attention drifted to late-night phone calls, sudden errands, unexplained absences. Craig confronted her more than once. "Who is it?" he would snap, his voice low but dangerous. Karen denied it first, dodging his questions, brushing them off as paranoia. But Craig was not a man to let go. He began snooping, checking her phone, driving past places she might be calling friends, pretending to be casual. And slowly, the truth bled through. There was someone else, and it wasn't just someone, it was Sunny. The moment Craig realized Karen was romantically involved with another woman, His anger doubled for him. This wasn't just betrayal, it was humiliation. He pictured neighbors whispering, co-workers smirking, his authority crumbling to Craig. Image was everything, and now his wife was destroying it. Sunny didn't hide her affection either. She and Karen were seen together at grocery stores, laughing too closely at coffee shops, whispering across the table, and though Karen tried to shield the children from it, Lauren noticed, Emily noticed, even young Sean sensed that Sunny wasn't just a friend. Craig grew obsessed. He followed them. He cornered Karen with questions. He warned her, begged her, threatened her, but the more he tried to pull her back, the further she slipped away. One evening, Karen made it clear, "I can't do this anymore. Craig, I don't love you." Those words hit him like a hammer in Craig's mind. Love wasn't a choice, it was duty, and Karen had just broken that sacred contract. The affair was no longer a rumor, it was reality, and as Craig's fury grew, so did his sense of desperation. He told himself he was fighting for his family, for his dignity, but beneath it all was something darker, a boiling rage, a voice whispering that if Karen wouldn't belong to him, she shouldn't belong to anyone. The cracks in the Kaler home had split wide open, and Craig was no longer just a husband losing his wife. He was a man standing at the edge of obsessions. Soon, he would step off that edge. Part 4. The murders. It was the night of November 14th, 2008, when the storm finally broke. The Kaler house, from the outside, looked calm, a cozy family home. Lights glowing in the windows, the kind of place where you'd expect nothing but warmth and safety, but inside, tension had been thick for weeks. Craig had stopped pretending. His temper was sharper, his stares colder. Karen avoided him as much as she could, slipping phone calls to Sunny when she thought no one was listening, but Craig was always listening. That night, neighbors later said, the house seemed unusually quiet. No music, no laughter, just silence. Craig confronted Karen in the kitchen. His voice wasn't just angry, it was broken, trembling between rage and despair. "You made me a fool, Karen. You ruined everything." Karen, exhausted, didn't back down this time. She told him it was over. She told him she was done living under his control, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. But those words, spoken aloud, were gasoline on a fire. At some point detectives would later piece together. Craig snapped. No more arguing, no more begging, no more pretending he could fix this. He grabbed a weapon, and the argument turned into horror. Attack on Karen was sudden and brutal. Neighbors would later recall hearing muffled sounds, a crash, maybe even a scream, but no one called police, not in this quiet town, not in the Kaler house, where appearances always seemed so perfect. But the horror didn't stop there. Emily, just 22, heard the chaos and rushed in to help her mother. She barely had time to react before Craig turned on her. The daughter who looked so much like Karen, the daughter who was old enough to defy him, the daughter who had seen too much by the time it was over. Both Karen and Emily lay dead-end. Craig was left standing in a house that no longer looked perfect. Blood where there used to be family dinners, silence where there used to be laughter. Lauren and Sean, the younger children, were spared, but not because of mercy, only because they weren't in the line of fire that night when investigators later arrived. They described the scene as one of the most haunting they'd ever walked into. A family home, frozen in time, shattered by unthinkable violence. Craig Kaler had crossed the line from jealous husband to murderer, and in the days that followed, the town of Springfield would realize that the perfect family on the hill had been hiding a nightmare all along. On the surface, it was just another autumn night in Springfield, Missouri. Leaves rustled outside, a cold wind pressed against the windows, and most families were winding down, dinner dishes stacked, televisions humming, children tucked into bed. But inside the Kaler home, the silence was dangerous. Craig had been pacing for hours. His mind was a storm, racing through images he couldn't erase. Karen smiling at Sunny, Karen whispering into her phone, Karen slipping further away each day. The humiliation burned him alive. Earlier that evening, Karen had prepared dinner, as she always did. Sean, the youngest, picked at his food, While Lauren chatted about school, Emily, home for a short visit, teased her little brother for a fleeting moment. The family almost looked normal again, but Craig's silence at the table said otherwise. His eyes never left Karen. When dinner ended, the children retreated to their rooms. Karen lingered in the kitchen, rinsing plates, her shoulders tense, and that's when Craig cornered her. The argument began with a whisper, a venomous hiss through clenched teeth. "You think you can humiliate me in my own house?" Karen didn't look at him. She was too tired for another fight, but Craig pressed on, his voice rising. "You're mine. Karen, do you hear me? You don't get to throw me away for her." Finally, Karen turned. Her face was pale but steady. "I'm not yours anymore. Craig, I can't live like this. I won't, for Craig." That was it. The words were a death sentence to his pride. Something in him snapped, a soundless crack deep in his chest. Investigators believe the first blow came fast. Craig grabbed a blunt object, later identified as a hammer, and struck Karen. She stumbled, blood blooming, but she didn't go down quietly. She fought back, clawing at him, trying to run, but Craig was stronger. Fueled by years of rage, he cornered her against the counter and brought the hammer down again. And again the struggle was loud enough that Emily heard it from the other room. She rushed in, horrified by the sight of her mother crumpling under her father's attack. "Dad, stop!" she screamed, rushing forward. But love was no shield. Craig turned on her, swinging wild and brutal. Emily tried to defend herself, tried to grab his arm, but he overpowered her within moments. She too fell. The house fell into a terrible quiet only. Craig's ragged breathing filled the room, echoing against the walls that had once sheltered family dinners and Christmas mornings. Blood soaked into the linoleum, spreading slowly, a grotesque stain on the family home. Lauren and Sean stayed hidden in their rooms, too frightened to move later. They would tell police they thought the noise was just another argument, until the silence became unbearable. By the time Craig stopped, the damage was irreversible. His wife and daughter gone, his family shattered, his perfect life destroyed by his own hands. The crime scene, when officers eventually entered the house, they described it as a nightmare frozen in time. Kitchen told the story without words. Plates still in the sink, a dish towel stained red, the hammer lying discarded on the floor. Karen's body lay near the counter, her face bloodied beyond recognition. Emily was a few feet away, her hands outstretched as if still trying to fight him off. Detectives said the brutality was shocking. These weren't quick killings, they were acts of rage. Neighbors later admitted they'd heard something, muffled shouts, a bang, but no one called 911 in a neighborhood like this. You didn't assume the worst, you trusted that families could handle their arguments. That trust allowed the horror to unfold. 5. The trial. When Craig was arrested, he showed little remorse. He was quiet, almost eerily calm, but underneath that calm was defiance in his mind. He was the victim. The trial became one of the most talked about cases in Missouri courtrooms, filled with reporters, neighbors, strangers, desperate to understand how a father could slaughter his own family. Craig's defense team painted him as a man pushed too far. They claimed he'd been humiliated, betrayed, emotionally destroyed by Karen's affair with Sonny. They spoke of his mental state, paranoia, depression, obsession, as if they were explanations, but the prosecution had a different story. They showed the jury photographs of the crime scene. They described the force of the blows, the brutality of the murders. This was not a moment of weakness. The prosecutor thundered, this was control, this was rage, this was murder. Lauren and Sean, the surviving children, were brought to testify. Their words cracked the courtroom, open with grief. Lauren, voice trembling, described hiding in her room, hearing her sister's screams. Then silent Sean, younger and softer spoken, simply said, I don't know why he didn't stop. The jury was visibly shaking Craig's behavior throughout the trial. Craig sat with his arms crossed, his expression shifting between blank and bitter. When photos of Karen and Emily were shown, he looked away, but when Sonny's name came up, his face twisted with fury. To him, she was the enemy. She had stolen his wife, destroyed his family in Craig's warped reality. Sonny was as guilty as he was. Psychologists testified that Craig showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder. He couldn't accept rejection, he couldn't tolerate humiliation, and when Karen finally broke free, his fragile sense of control collapsed into violence. The trial dragged on for weeks, but in the end, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated only a few hours before returning with their decision. Craig Kaler was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, Lauren wept. Sean buried his face in his hands and Craig sat stone still, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, refusing to look at anyone for the town of Springfield. The Kaler case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that behind the perfect image of any family, there could be shadows no one sees. For Lauren and Sean, the scars would never fade. They had lost their mother, their sister, and their father, all in one night. Tanned. For Karen and Emily, their voices were silenced, but their story lives on, whispered like a warning in the night. Sometimes the danger isn't outside the home, sometimes it's waiting inside. Wearing the face of the one who swore to love you. Part 6. The legacy. The trial ended. The cameras left, but the silence in the Kaler home never did. The house on West Chestnut Street became a hollow monument for months after the murders. Neighbors would avoid walking too close. Curtains stayed drawn. Children whispered about it when they biked past, calling it the haunted house. It wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by Mary inside. Bloodstains had been scrubbed, carpets replaced, walls painted over, but everyone knew what had happened. Their paint couldn't cover it. Lauren and Sean. For Lauren and Sean, life splintered in two that night. Lauren was 15. Sean only 12, old enough to understand what they'd lost, too young to carry it. Counselors would later say the children exhibited symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks, nightmares, sudden panic when doors slammed or voices rose. Lauren grew quiet, once bubbly and social. She avoided friends when classmates asked about her father. She changed the subject when teachers asked about her future. She shrugged. Sean retreated into video games, disappearing into glowing screens where monsters could be beaten and bad guys always lost. But in real life, the monster had been his father, and the bad guy had won at least part of the story in court. They had testified bravely, but afterward, when the reporters stopped calling and the lawyers stopped visiting, the weight of it all crushed them and silenced Sunni's shadow. And then there was Sunny. She hadn't swung the hammer, hadn't spilled the blood, but her name was carved into the story like a scar. The town whispered about her. Was she really worth it? Did she know what she was doing? Sunny herself rarely spoke publicly about the case in private. She grieved for Karen and Emily. She had never wanted this, but Craig blamed her until the end. In his letters from prison, he sometimes ranted about her, writing her name with venom, as if she had been the one to betray him in court. For Sunny, there would be no escaping the association to strangers. She wasn't just Sunny anymore. She was the other woman in the Kaler murders. Springfield's memory. The city of Springfield moved on, as cities always do. New crimes took headlines, new scandals filled papers, but the Kaler murders lingered, a permanent stain in the town's memory. People still talk about it in hushed tones. Parents warn their daughters, be careful who you trust. Pastors use it as an example of what unchecked anger can do. Neighbors shake their heads when they pass the old Kaler house. It became more than a case. It became a cautionary tale. Part 7. Lessons in control. The Kaler murders weren't born in a single night of madness. They were the final act in a long play of control, obsession, and denial. Experts who studied the case agree. Craig's story is the anatomy of domestic violence in slow motion. First, there's charm. The abuser makes you feel chosen, special, protected. Friends envy the relationship to outsiders. It looks ideal. Then comes control. Small requests. Don't wear that dress. Don't go out tonight. Requests that harden into rules. Next comes isolation. Friends drift away. Family feels distant suddenly. The victim's whole world is wrapped around the abuser. Finally, when control slips, Violence waits because, for a narcissist, rejection isn't loss, it's betrayal, and betrayal must be punished. Craig Kaler followed the script like a shadow play. Karen tried to step out of it, tried to reclaim her life, but he didn't see freedom, he saw humiliation. The cost of silence. Neighbors admitted later they'd noticed things. Arguments. Karen looking drained. Craig's short temper, but they stayed silent. Nobody wants to pry into a marriage. Nobody wants to believe a father could become a killer, but silence costs lives. Had someone stepped in sooner? Had Karen felt safer to speak? Maybe the story would have ended differently. Maybe she and Emily would still be alive. Society. Blind spot. The Kaler case exposes a blind spot. We know how to talk about strangers who are dangerous. We don't know how to talk about danger inside the family. Police reports show that most women killed in domestic violence cases are killed after leaving their partners, not before. The moment of freedom is also the moment of greatest danger. Curran never made it through that threshold. The whisper end. So the story lingers like a whisper at the edge of sleep. If you see control, speak. If you hear screams, call. If you feel unsafe, trust it, because monsters don't always hide in the dark woods. Sometimes they live in your house, sitting across from you at dinner, smiling for family photos, kissing you goodnight. Closing thought. Kaler sits in a cell, the world outside moving on without him. His children grow older without him. His victims rest in silence without justice that can never feel whole. The legacy of his crime isn't just blood on linoleum, it's the chilling reminder that love, when twisted into possession, becomes lethal. And so the crime whisper leaves us with this. Sometimes the most dangerous place isn't the alley at midnight, it's the home that looks safe from the outside. Part 8. The prison years. The gavel had fallen. The cell door slammed for Craig Michael Kaler. The world shrank to a concrete box and a steel bed. Prison life is routine, but for a man like Craig, it was tormenting. His first years behind bars, he wrote letters constantly, pages of rambling, scripts sent to anyone who would read. To his children, 2 relatives, 2 journalists, each one told the same story. He wasn't guilty of murder, he was guilty of heartbreak. They painted me as a monster. One letter read, "But I was a husband who loved too much, a father who only wanted his family, but love had never been the issue. Possession had control." Had in prison, Craig couldn't control anything, and that ate him alive. The man behind bars. Other inmates quickly learned who Craig was. Notorious cases don't stay secret in prison. Whispers spread down the cell blocks. "That's the guy who killed his wife and kids." Some inmates avoided him, others mocked him. The cruelest called him Daddy Hammer. Craig hated it. He demanded respect, demanded the narrative be rewritten. He tried joining Bible groups, preaching about forgiveness. But even there, he twisted sermons into self-pity. Even Job was tested. He told one chaplain, "They don't see my suffering, they only see what they want to see." The chaplain nodded, but later admitted privately, Craig never talked about his victims, only about himself. The letters to Lauren and Sean for his children. Craig's letters were daggers disguised as apologized. He wrote about missing them, about how one day they'd understand that what happened wasn't murder. It was desperation. He begged them to visit. He begged them to forgive. Lauren never replied. She had grown tired of his manipulation. Sean answered once, a short note, "We survived you. That's all you need to know." Craig carried that letter in his pocket until the ink smeared into illegibility. He showed it to cellmates, as if it proved something, but it proved only this: his children were alive without him, and that was a wound prison could never heal. Decline over the years. Craig's arrogance eroded, his hair thinned, his posture slumped. Guards noticed he spoke less, spent more time alone, staring at the wall. Some said he had become paranoid, whispering about conspiracies, claiming Sonny had cursed him. Others said he had become obsessed with true crime documentaries, watching cases that mirrored his own, and muttering, "They don't understand what drives a man." But there was no redemption arc here, no sudden clarity. Craig never admitted guilt, never said Emily's name without deflection. He remained, to the end, a man who believed the world had wronged him. And so, the prison years weren't about reform, They were about slow decay, a man shrinking into the shadow of his crime. Part 9. The Psychology of a Family Annihilator. Craig Kaler's story is horrifying, but it is not unique. He belongs to a category criminologists call family annihilators. Men, rarely women, who kill their families in acts of rage, despair, or control. They are not monsters in the obvious sense. They don't lurk in alleys or stalk strangers. They are fathers, husbands, neighbors, the men who mow their lawns, wave from the driveway, attend Sunday service, and that is what makes them so terrifying. 4 types. Experts categorize family annihilators into 4 types. The self-righteous, he blames his partner for the collapse of the family he kills to punish her, to show her she was at fault. Craig fits this category perfectly. The anomic. He sees his family as an extension of his success when financial ruin strikes. He destroys them because he feels they no longer fit the disappointed. He believes his family has failed him, not living up to his expectations. The paranoid. He kills to protect them from imagined threats. Poverty, shame, outsiders was the self-righteous archetype. Through and through, Karen's desire for freedom wasn't just rejection, it was betrayal, and in his mind, betrayal had only one answer: punishment. Family annihilators often share traits with narcissists. They lack empathy. They see relationships as property. They rewrite reality to protect their fragile egos. Craig showed all of this. He blamed Sonny, not himself. He spoke of his children as possessions, not people. He never once admitted Karen and Emily had their own dreams, their own lives. To Craig, they weren't individuals. They were satellites orbiting his sun when they threatened to break away. He set the universe on fire. Cases like this leave behind questions. Could it have been stopped? Were there warnings? Yes, always. Craig had a history of control. Current had confided to friends about arguments. Neighbors heard the shouting. Soon his presence escalated his obsession. But like so many cases, the warnings were whispers in a storm. People noticed but didn't act. People worried but stayed silent, and so the storm broke. The crime whisper reminds us, family annihilators aren't born in the moment of murder. They are shaped over years by pride, by silence, by unchecked control, and if we do not speak when the warning signs emerge, the silence becomes complicity. Craig Kaler sits in his prison cell, staring at a photo of his children, frozen in time before the blood, before the hammer. He sees himself as a tragic figure. The world sees him as a killer, and somewhere in Springfield, people still drive past that house on West Chestnut Street, lowering their voices, reminding each other of the night control turned into carnage. Because the Kaler murders aren't just a story of one man's rage. They are a story of what happens when love rots into ownership, and when silence gives the rot room to grow up. 10. Echoes of silence. Time erodes memory, but it never erases blood. Springfield, Missouri has grown, houses built, new families moving in, but the shadow of the Kaler murders lingers like a scar. Neighbors still remember the night of sirens, the night crime scene tape wrapped around the quiet house on West Chestnut Street. Children who grew up nearby recall being told not to look out the window, and today, when they drive past that house, they lower their voices, because some crimes never belong to the past. They stay alive, whispered through generations. The survivors. For Lauren and Sean, life moved forward, but never untouched. They learned to live. With the title survivor, they carried the weight of a father who became their executioner. They learned that sometimes the monsters aren't strangers. Sometimes they share your last name. Lauren once said in an interview, "People tell me I'm strong for surviving, but strength isn't a choice when your only other option is death." Sean avoided interviews altogether. He preferred silence, but those who knew him said his silence wasn't weakness, it was resistance. He refused to give his father's crime more oxygen than it already had. The children lived on, and that was the only justice that mattered. The forgotten voices. What about Emily? What about Karen? Their voices were buried beneath headlines that obsessed over Craig. Emily was only 17, a bright student, a girl who wanted to be a nurse. Her friends said she laughed too loud, that she loved singing in the car with the windows down. She had plans, dreams, crushes all of it stolen in one swing of a hammer. Karen was 46, a mother who tried, for years, to hold a crumbling marriage together, a woman who finally found the courage to walk away, only to have her courage punished with blood. It is too easy to let killers dominate the narrative, but the crime whisper insists. Victims deserve the last word. Springfield's ghost in Springfield. True crime buffs still whisper about the Kaler case. Some say the house is haunted, others claim they hear phantom screams on quiet nights. Rational minds dismiss it, but deep down, everyone knows. Places remember. And so the Kaler home is not just wood and brick, it is a monument to silence, to the cost of ignoring red flags, to the danger of mistaking control for love. Craig's last years in prison. Craig grew older, his letters stopped, his arrogance faded into bitterness. Guards say he spent hours staring at the wall, lips moving, as though arguing with people who were no longer alive. He died quietly, years later, not from execution, not from violence, but from the slow collapse of a body that had spent too long rotting in a cage. There was no vigil, no candlelight. His death passed like a whisper in a storm, barely noticed, barely mourned, and maybe that was justice. The whisper, every crime whisper case leaves a message, a thread tying victim and killer to the listener. The Kaler case whispers this: control is not love, possession is not devotion. When silence protects abusers, violence fills the void. And sometimes the scariest killers don't hide in the dark. Sometimes they eat dinner at your table. Final image, imagine it, the Kaler house. Late at night, the street is quiet, the windows are dark, the world has moved on, but if you stand outside long enough, in the stillness, you swear you can hear it. A hammer falling, a scream cut short, a voice whispering, "They were mine," and the echo never stops. Part 11, Epilogue. The weight of silence. The courtroom emptied. Reporters packed up their cameras. Families filed out quietly, some in tears, some relieved, some exhausted. The trial of Craig Kaler had reached its inevitable conclusion. But the story didn't end with the judge's gavel, because true crime rarely ends where the legal system stops. Lingers, it stains, it haunts. And in the case of Craig, Karen, Sonny, and the children, the echoes of that night in Berlin, Kansas, would spread far beyond the farmhouse. The fractured families. Karen's family tried to stitch themselves back together, but how do you sew a wound that deep? Her daughters, Lauren and Emily, were forced to live with the knowledge that their father had called them rotting corpses, had disowned them for supporting their mother, and had then taken her life in the most brutal way imaginable. Just 10 years old, when his world shattered, was left carrying a scar, invisible to the eye, but written into his bones. His last holiday with his father had turned into a prelude to murder. He would grow up with questions no child should ever have to ask. Did my dad ever really love me? Did I do something wrong? Could I have stopped him? Children of killers often face a double burden, grieving the loss of their victim parent, while simultaneously processing the shame of sharing blood with the murderer. It's a weight that doesn't lift. It mutates. Some find resilience, others are consumed. Craig's parents, who had once welcomed their son back into their home after he lost his job, now had to live with the knowledge that their boy, their flesh and blood, had not only destroyed a marriage, but destroyed generations' family. Reunions turned into ghostly reminders of absences, empty chairs at dinner tables, holidays hollowed out. The communities whisper. Kansas was a town of fewer than 1,000 people. Small towns. Don't forget, everyone knew Dorothy, the sweet 89-year-old grandmother who had lived in her farmhouse for decades. Her home had been a place of warmth, of pies cooling on windowsills, of grandchildren laughing on the porch. Now it was a crime scene. Neighbors spoke of it in hushed tones. Some drove by slower than usual, staring at the quiet house with curtains drawn. Others avoided it altogether, unwilling to face the memories of flashing police lights and crime scene tapes. Small towns survive on reputation. Gossip circulates like blood, and in Berlin, the whispers were sharp. He seemed so normal. We all saw the warning signs. Why didn't anyone stop him? The truth was both simple and unbearable. People had seen it coming. The stalking, the cameras, the slashed tires, the erratic behavior at work, the controlling marriage it had been building for years, but no one believed. Craig would cross the final line until he didn't in small towns. Guilt spreads like wildfire. People asked themselves if they could have intervened, if the system should have done more, if silence had been complicitizing. Psychology of control. At the heart of the Kaler case wasn't just murder, it was control. Craig had always seen himself as the center, the provider, the husband, the father, the man who deserved loyalty when his marriage crumbled, when his wife sought comfort elsewhere, when his daughters sided with their mother. His control slipped in rather than accept loss. He doubled down. Psychologists studying the case later pointed to the classic traits of coercive control: isolating his wife by hacking into her emails and planting cameras, financial dominance, obsessing over money and child support, emotional manipulation, turning the children against their mother, escalation to violence when his authority was challenged. This was not a crime of sudden passion. It was a slow burn, a simmering resentment, years in the making, that finally boiled over. And perhaps the most chilling part, many people, even outside of Berlin, recognized elements of Craig in people they knew. A neighbor, a boss, a spouse. That's the haunting part about cases like this. To outsiders, Craig was normal: a good job, a family, a house, barbecues in the summer, smiles and Christmas cards. But normal is fragile behind closed doors. Families fracture, control festers, resentments rotund when that thin veneer cracks. What spills out can be darker than anyone ever imagined. The Kaler murders forced people to look at their own lives, at their own relationships, at the silent bargains made in marriages, at the compromises that curdle into resentment. It was a mirror, and the reflection wasn't always comforting. Craig would spend the rest of his life in prison. He became inmate number, redacted, stripped of the titles that once defined him: husband, father, provider. In prison, killers like Craig often develop one of two identities. Either they cling to denial, painting themselves as victims of circumstance, or they lean into their notoriety, wearing their crime like a badge. Craig did a little of both. He wrote long letters insisting Karen had betrayed him, insisting he was pushed to the edge, insisting Sonny had poisoned his marriage. But he also bragged to fellow inmates about the infamy of his case, about how everyone knew his name. Prison walls contained his body, but not his bitterness. And bitterness, unlike flesh, does not decay. And what of Sonny? She had not pulled the trigger, but she had been the spark. The woman Craig despised, the woman Karen chose, the woman who represented, in Craig's mind, humiliation after Karen's death. Sonny disappeared from public view. She stopped giving interviews, stopped answering questions, stopped appearing in public with friends. Some said she moved away, changed her name, tried to build a quiet life elsewhere. Others said she lived like a ghost, her days shadowed by guilt, her nights haunted by what Tifsa had loved Karen, but she had also lost her because of that love. And that paradox is the kind of torment that no prison could match. So, what do we take from this? True crime stories often get boiled down to their most dramatic moments: the affair, the fight, the murder, the trial. But beneath those headlines lie deeper truths about human nature. The Kaler case isn't just about one man's rage. It's about the fragility of control, about the danger of silence, about the way communities see red flags but hesitate to act until it's too late. And maybe it's also about the lies we tell ourselves. Karen once told police she gave in to Craig just to keep the peace, that it was easier to surrender than to fight. But that choice, that small surrender, repeated night after night, was not peace. It was survival, and survival, in silence, is never enough, because silence does not protect. It festers, and eventually, silence kills. And so tonight, as you lie in bed, think of the farmhouse in Berlin, Kansas. Think of the family once gathered there, the grandmother, the daughters, the son, the mother who just wanted love. Think of the man who couldn't let go, who thought control was love, who thought destruction was his only answer. And ask yourself, in your own life, in your own relationships, Where does silence linger? Where does control hide? Where do small compromises mask deeper cracks? Because the scariest thing about the Kaler murders isn't that they happened, it's that they could happen anywhere, and perhaps, just perhaps, they already are. Epilogue. The weight of silence when the dust finally settled on Craig Kaler's trial. Berlin, Kansas found itself staring at a truth it didn't want to hold. The farmhouse where Dorothy had lived for decades, the house that had been a gathering place for pies and laughter, was now marked forever as a crime scene. Neighbors drove past slowly, some crossing themselves, others shaking their heads. Everyone whispered the same thing: how could it happen here? In small towns, tragedy doesn't just belong to one family. It bleeds across fences, down Main Street. Through Sunday's sermons, the Kaler story was no longer private. It belonged to everyone who had shared a smile with Karen, everyone who had waved to Craig at the gas station, everyone who had taught Sean or Emily or Lauren in school. Craig was gone, swallowed by the prison system. Karen was gone, buried alongside Dorothy. Sunny was gone, her life cut short for daring to love. The children were scattered, left to patch together lives from the fragments of memory and trauma. And Berlin itself, it was left with a silence so heavy it clung to every Thanksgiving table, every empty chair, every quiet prayer whispered in the pews. Trauma in the bloodline. Experts would later say that cases like this are not just about one man's rage, but about the ripple effects of untreated control, pride, and obsession. Craig's need to dominate his family, to control the narrative, to force love where love had long since died, was the root of everything. When that control was threatened, he reached for violence. Lauren and Emily would grow into women with their own families, but the shadow of that night never truly left them. They carried not only the grief of losing their mother and grandmother, but also the betrayal of knowing their father, the man who once kissed their scraped knees, had chosen death over dialogue. Sean, just a boy then, lived with the scars of being the son who stayed behind with Craig. That Thanksgiving survivor's guilt crept in, gnawing at him during sleepless nights. He would forever wrestle with the questions: could I have stopped him? Should I have known? Questions no child should ever have to carry. The town's wounds. For Berlin, healing was complicated. People spoke in hushed tones about the Kalers. The older generation, the churchgoers, framed it as sin overtaking a family. The younger ones whispered about love gone wrong, about how Sunny and Karen had only wanted happiness, but what tied them all together was fear. Fear that the man sitting next to you at the diner, the quiet husband at the PTA meeting, might be hiding a storm. No one could see. Fear that what looked like the perfect family could crumble into a nightmare overnight. The farmhouse sat abandoned for years after the murders. Windows boarded up, weeds rising tall against the porch, the mailbox still bearing the name Kaler in faded paint. Teenagers dared each other to creep up at night, swearing they heard footsteps inside. Farmers passing on their tractors said they saw curtains shift, though the house had been sealed for months. Whether it was imagination or something darker, one thing was certain: the house itself had become part of the story, a physical scar on the land. Some towns tear down houses like that, eager to erase the stain, but not Berlin here. The house was left standing, a reminder, or maybe a warning. Children's ghosts, Lauren, Emily, and Sean, each carried their parents' ghosts in different ways. Lauren grew up fast. Friends remembered her as quiet, withdrawn, but sharp-eyed, a girl who trusted few, because the person she trusted most had betrayed her in the worst way. In college, when people asked about her family, she gave vague answers. Some survivors of family violence learned to numb themselves, to build walls so high nothing can breach them. Lauren's wall was nearly impenetrably mommy. The middle child wrestled with anger. In therapy, she would slam her fists against pillows, screaming that her father had stolen her life. She didn't just grieve, she raged. Some said this rage made her resilient, but Emily knew it was a double-edged sword. It kept her strong, but it also kept her alone. In Sean, he carried the heaviest weight. He had been with Craig that night, sharing food, playing games. hearing laughter that he would never hear again for years. He blamed himself. Survivor's guilt as a poison, slow, invisible, but devastating. Sean would replay the hours, the minutes, the seconds before his father picked up the hammer, asking the same question. Why didn't I see it coming? But how could a child? How could anyone? The town's whisper network. Berlin had always been a quiet town. Gossip at the diner, chatter at Sunday services, the hum of tractors in the distance after the murders. The town's voice changed. Conversations dropped when someone entered the room. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks, speaking in half sentences, as though the full truth might summon the horror back. The older women in town whispered that Karen had been too bold, that she should have stayed quiet, endured her husband's temper. Others defended her fiercely, calling her brave for finally trying to leave. These divisions split the town, not openly, but in whispers, sideways glances, and subtle judgments. But perhaps the darkest whisper was this. People had seen the cracks. They had noticed Craig's temper, the way Karen flinched, the way her smile didn't always reach her eyes. And yet, no one stepped in, not family, not neighbors, not the church. The silence wasn't just Craig's, it belonged to everyone. The psychology of control experts who later studied the case pointed to one word: control. Craig's life was built on the illusion of stability. A wife who cooked, cleaned, smiled on command, children who obeyed, who reflected his image back to the world, a mother-in-law who kept her distance. But when that illusion cracked, when Karen chose love elsewhere, when Sonny gave her something Craig never could, he didn't see it as betrayal, he saw it as theft in his mind. They had stolen his family, his name, his dignity to him. Killing them wasn't just an act of rage, it was reclamation, twisted, brutal, but in Craig's fractured logic, it was justice. That's the chilling truth about family annihilators. They rarely see themselves as monsters. They see themselves as victims. Echoes across America. The Kaler case isn't an isolated tragedy. Across the United States, family annihilation repeats itself with eerie familiarity. A husband loses his job and, unable to face shame, kills his wife and children. A wife, cornered by years of abuse, lashes out in a final act of desperation. A parent, unwilling to lose custody, decides if they can't have the children. No one will, and each time, neighbors say the same thing. We never thought it could happen here, but it does again and again. Every Thanksgiving in Berlin carries a shadow now. Families gather around their tables, the smell of turkey filling the air, children laughing, but in the back of every mind is the reminder. One Thanksgiving, not so long ago, ended in blood. Some avoid talking about it altogether. Others bring it up in hushed tones, warning their children about jealousy, about control, about the dangers of silence. The Kalers became a lesson, not the one Craig wanted, but one carved in blood and memory. That love cannot be forced, that control, masquerading as love, will always, eventually, collapse. So what do we take from this? That evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a husband's smile, a father's steady hand, a neighbor's nod at the grocery store. Sometimes it tucks its children into bed, only to shatter their world the next morning. Remind us that silence can be deadly, that noticing isn't enough. Speaking matters, acting matters, because behind too many doors, behind too many perfect smiles, storms are brewing. And when those storms break, they don't just take one life, they take families, legacies, communities. Craig thought he had the final word. He thought by silencing Karen, Dorothy, and Sonny, he could rewrite the story. But here we are, still telling it, still whispering it, still refusing to let his silence win. Because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to refuse to let the living forget. In this, dear listener, is where we are left, not with answers, but with questions. How many Kalers live among us today? How many families smile for Christmas photos while hiding bruises, secrets, resentments that could one day ignite into fire? Craig believed he was losing control of his wife, his children, his reputation, and instead of letting go, he tightened his grip until the only thing left in his hands was blood. That's the weight of silence, the silence of neighbors who noticed something was wrong, but said nothing. The silence of friends who saw bruises but didn't ask, the silence inside Craig himself, festering until it exploded. Craig Kaler was only days away from his upcoming court appearance over the earlier domestic incident. With divorce proceedings scheduled to begin in January, many hoped that once the holidays passed, things might settle and move forward more peacefully. But on Saturday, November 29, 2009, that hope was shattered around 6 p.m. Deputy Sheriff Nathan Perling received a call about a suspicious vehicle in Berlin. A neighbor reported seeing a small truck speeding through the area. The driver stopped, got out, and returned moments later, carrying a large, unidentified object. When confronted, the man quickly tossed it into his truck and sped away. Perling responded. Another call came in, this time far more disturbing. Moments later, a third call followed. A couple had opened their door to find a terrified 10-year-old boy begging for help. It was Sean Kaler. He frantically told them that there had been a shooting at Dorothy White's house. Deputies rushed to the scene. Inside, they found 89-year-old Dorothy White, bleeding heavily on the kitchen floor. Clinging to life after being shot multiple times in the dining area lay Karen Kaler, already dead from 2 gunshot wounds. Emily, just 18 years old, was discovered behind the living room couch. She too had been shot twice, likely trying to hide. As the gunman moved through the house upstairs, officers heard faint cries. It was 16-year-old Lauren, critically wounded, but still alive. Before being rushed to the hospital, she managed to whisper that it was her father, Craig, who had opened fire. Tragically, Lauren died shortly after arriving at the hospital. Dorothy fought on but remained in grave condition. Sean, the only surviving witness inside the home, later recounted the horror. He and Karen had been cleaning old coins at the sink when Craig entered through the back door, carrying a rifle. Craig immediately opened fire on Karen. Sean ducked, bolted out the back door, and ran around to the front, hoping to get inside and call for help. But when he saw Craig moving through the house, he shut the door and sprinted to find neighbors. Instead, an alert for Craig went out across the county. Before long, a resident reported seeing a man abandon a vehicle and flee down a deserted road. The truck matched the earlier description, and inside, deputies found ammunition, unopened anxiety medication, and a backpack filled with canned food, soap, and supplies, suggesting Craig had planned to hide out. But Craig himself was gone after an 8-hour manhunt. Officers finally spotted him wandering aimlessly by the roadside at dawn, disheveled and exhausted. Craig raised his hands and admitted, "I'm the guy you're looking for." He carried a revolver, pocket knives, cash, and survival gear, but surrendered without incident. During interrogation, Craig spoke openly. He admitted to struggling with Karen's affair, especially after realizing that their daughters not only knew about the relationship, but even accompanied her on trips to meet her lover, Sonny. He described seeing them together as a spectacle and claimed his emotions spiraled out of control. Craig was charged with first-degree murder and aggravated burglary. His bail set at $10 million on December 1, 2009. Dorothy White succumbed to her injuries, bringing the death toll to 4 at his preliminary hearing in December 2010. Craig entered an insanity plea, claiming his breakdown was triggered by affair, the loss of his job, and being forced to move back in with his parents. His defense pointed to his erratic behavior, the untouched medication in his car, and his lack of attempt to cover up the killings as signs of a disturbed mental state. However, Kansas had changed its laws in 1995, abolishing the traditional insanity defense. Under the new rules, a defendant could no longer claim they didn't know right from wrong. Instead, they had to prove that their mental illness made them incapable of forming intent or acting with premeditation. Craig's attorneys argued his deteriorating mental health met that standard. The defense argued that Craig's mental health struggles, his depression, hallucinations, and diagnosed personality disorders, proved that the murders weren't planned, but rather the result of a sudden breakdown. They insisted he had simply snapped, but prosecutors told a very different story to them. Craig's actions showed calculation. He didn't kill his son Sean, despite Sean being just steps away, which suggested deliberate choices, not a loss of control. Their psychiatric expert agreed. While Craig did suffer from depression, he was still capable of planning murder. The most powerful testimony came from Sean himself, just 12 years old, speaking via video link. His calm but heartbreaking account left the courtroom stunned. "My dad came through the door and shot my mom. I heard her collapse to the floor." Observers noted how mature and unwavering he sounded. Despite recounting the worst night of his life, graphic crime scene photos were so disturbing that people in the courtroom had to look away, some even crying. Prosecutors also highlighted Craig's long history of controlling and abusive behavior, insisting that violence had always been in him, waiting to surface. Karen's partner, Sonny Ree, testified that Craig had seemed fine with their relationship until Karen finally left. Then his anger consumed him. On August 25, 2011, the jury returned a unanimous verdict in just 2 hours. Craig Kaler was guilty of capital murder. His insanity plea was rejected. That meant only 2 possible outcomes: life without parole or the death penalty. During sentencing, family members gave powerful impact statements. Sean, showing extraordinary compassion, asked that his father not be executed. "I don't want my whole family gone," he said softly, but ultimately, the judge sentenced Craig to death. Those present said Craig showed no emotion at the verdict, no remorse, no sadness. Some even claimed he looked smug, smirking during proceedings. As he was led away, he shouted to his parents, "Take care of Sean so he's not raised by a bunch of freaks." Even on death row, Craig continued to show no regret. In letters he wrote, including one to the prosecutor, he said he felt relieved, claiming he had freed Sean. His legal team filed multiple appeals, arguing that jury misconduct and his mental illness hadn't been fairly considered, but the Kansas Supreme Court rejected his claims. One judge noted that while Kansas does account for mental health during trial and sentencing, it doesn't recognize the broader insanity defense Craig wanted. By 2023, he had exhausted nearly every avenue for appeal. Karen's loved ones channeled their grief into action. Lynn and Sonny organized community runs in her memory to raise money for victims of domestic violence. Sean, after briefly being in state care, was raised by his grandparents against all odds. He graduated high school and now works in Kansas, carrying with him unimaginable loss, yet also incredible resiliency. Kaler murders devastated a community and destroyed 3 generations of one family in a single night. For Sean, who lost his mother, sisters, great-grandmother, and ultimately his father, the trauma was beyond comprehension. That he survived it and rebuilt a life speaks to his strength and perseverance. Story 2. The world of dark tourism. In today's world, fascination with true crime and real-life tragedies is at an all-time high. One growing industry, known as dark tourism, has turned morbid curiosity into global travel. From Jack the Ripper tours in London to prison visits at Alcatraz, people spend millions each year exploring sites tied to murder, death, and suffering. But why are we drawn to these places? What impact do they have on the communities around them? The new book 50 Dark Destinations tackles these questions head-on, written by leading criminologists, historians, and psychologists. It explores the rise of dark tourism by examining 50 infamous sites worldwide. Each chapter sheds light on the history, psychology, and ethical dilemmas tied to visiting places linked to tragedy. Far from sensationalizing, the book presents criminology in an accessible way, encouraging readers to think critically about the blurred line between education and exploitation. 50 Dark Destinations offers a fascinating, thought-provoking look at how human beings engage with the darker sides of history, and why we can't seem to look away. 47-year-old Lindsay Beck was a devoted mother of 2, living in Huncote, a village on the outskirts of Accrington, Lancashire, in her early 20s, during a night out. she met the man who would become her husband, Tim Beck, Tim later said. Lindsay's beauty instantly caught his attention. After 3 years of dating, they married, and soon welcomed their first child, Stephen, followed 2 years later by their daughter Sarah. Lindsay worked as a teaching assistant at a local primary school, supporting children with additional learning needs. She loved kids deeply, and often went above and beyond, even creating props and sets for school plays with her artistic talent, athletic and outdoorsy. She also enjoyed long country walks, but, after 20 years of marriage, Lindsay and Tim grew apart, realizing they had different dreams. They divorced amicably, remaining close friends who supported each other when needed. Lindsay moved to a house on Burnley Road in Accrington and started a new relationship, while Tim eventually did the same on August 12, 2019. Lindsay spent the day shopping in Blackburn with Sarah, who had just finished her GCSEs. After browsing the mall and stopping at Asda, Lindsay dropped her daughter off around 3 p.m., reminding her they'd meet again for dinner at 6 with Sarah's boyfriend. She told Sarah she loved her before driving off. When Sarah and her boyfriend arrived at Lindsay's house later that evening, the door was locked, and there was no sign of her. Sarah hadn't brought her key. Assuming her mother would be home, calls and texts to Lindsay went unanswered. Her phone switched off. Growing worried, Sarah phoned her father. Tim picked them up, and the family returned to the house with a spare key inside. Everything appeared normal, but Lindsay was gone. By midnight, Tim called police. "My ex-wife's missing." He said this isn't like her at all. Officers quickly classified Lindsay as a higher-risk missing person. Tim was questioned, but soon ruled out his alibi was airtight. Investigators began piecing together Lindsay's last movements. CCTV captured her walking down Burnley Road with her phone and keys, known for her love of exercise. It appeared she had headed into a woodland area called the Coppice, a place she often walked. Search efforts escalated rapidly. Police deployed drones, helicopters, and rescue teams, while hundreds of locals volunteered to comb the area. Missing persons posters spread, and a dedicated Facebook group gained over 10,000 members. The community response was extraordinary, from seasoned hikers to parents with strollers. Everyone was desperate to help. A dog walker found a red garment on a fence, similar to the lining of Lindsay's jacket, but as days passed, there was still no sign of her. For days into the search, Detective Chief Inspector Alan Davies held a press conference, urging anyone who had been in the Coppice around 4:30 p.m. that day to come forward later that evening. Hundreds more joined community-organized searches, moving friends and family to tears with their determination. As the week wore on, rivers were searched, and the community refused to give up. Then, on August 24, 2019, 12 days after Lindsay vanished, police received a chilling. Calaman, walking his dog in Accrington Cemetery, noticed his pet dart into a wooded area. When he followed, he stepped on something soft and foul-smelling. The stench of decay filled the air. Flies swarmed. Looking closer, he realized it was a human leg. Lindsay's naked body, wrapped in plastic, had been buried in a shallow grave. Soil from the cemetery had been piled on top in an attempt to hide it. When police arrived at Tim's door that night, Sarah said she knew instantly it wasn't the news she hoped for. Detective Superintendent Andy Cribben later confirmed, at around 8 p.m. on Saturday, "We received a call. Officers attended Accrington Cemetery, where sadly, the body of a woman was found. While formal identification has yet to take place, we believe it to be Lindsay Beck. A murder investigation is now underway, and her family has been informed." Family liaison officers were immediately assigned to support Lindsay's relatives as detectives launched a public appeal. Investigators urged anyone who had been in the Burley Road or Peel Park Avenue areas on the day of her disappearance to come forward. They also requested CCTV footage from both neighborhoods, as well as from Ainton Cemetery, in the hope that someone might have captured suspicious activity during the previous 2 to 3 weeks. Specialist officers and forensic teams combed through the cemetery, working meticulously to establish what had happened, when it had occurred, and who was responsible. The scale of the investigation grew quickly, with dozens of detectives and staff committed to bringing Lindsay's killer to justice as news of her tragic discovery spread. The local community was left heartbroken. Flowers were laid in her memory, many accompanied by notes from strangers who admitted that, even without knowing her personally, Lindsay's story had touched their hearts. A vigil was held at Peel Park, where mourners stood in silence before a choir performed Amazing Grace. The local church overflowed with people lighting candles, and floral tributes were placed outside her former school. Lindsay's ex-husband, Tim, described himself as broken by the news, devastated not only for himself, but also for his children, who had now lost their mother in such brutal circumstances. Office pathologist, Dr. Naomi Carter, performed the post-mortem and revealed the chilling details. Lindsay had died from catastrophic neck injuries in her 25 years of experience. Dr. Carter said she had never seen such extensive crushing damage to an entire larynx, injuries more consistent with an industrial accident than with an assault due to the level of decomposition. Lindsay's body had to be identified using dental records. The state of her remains also meant that it was impossible to confirm whether she had been sexually assaulted. Disturbingly, there were signs that an attempt had been made to saw off one of her legs. The urgency to catch her killer intensified, and fear spread through the community that another person could be targeted. On August 25th, forensic officers carried out a detailed search of the cemetery near one of the graves. They recovered a pair of gloves and a saw. Both tested positive for blood. Lindsay's DNA was found on the outside of the gloves, while the inside revealed a male DNA profile. Her shoes were later discovered in a skip, wrapped in a blue plastic bag and cut apart, yet the rest of her clothing was never recovered. Botanical evidence suggested she had not been killed at the cemetery. Grass and foliage trapped between her body and the plastic wrapping were inconsistent with plant life in the burial grounds, pointing to another location, likely the nearby copse she had entered shortly after leaving home. The most significant clue, however, came in the form of a blue wheelie bin. Searchers had spotted it during the early days of Lindsay's disappearance, and even reported it to police. At the time, she was still classified as a missing person, and officers dismissed it as irrelevant. No one realized its importance until much later. Then, while reviewing CCTV footage, detectives spotted a breakthrough on August 17th, 5 days after Lindsay was last seen. A young man in a gray tracksuit was recorded dragging a blue wheelie bin along Burnley Road before turning onto Whitewall Road and heading toward the cemetery. The discovery electrified the investigation. Still, police hesitated to release the footage immediately. If the man was innocent, public exposure could put him at serious risk for 24 hours. They searched national databases in an effort to identify him, but came up empty-handed. Meanwhile, a new witness emerged. A woman reported encountering a lone male in the copse around the same time. Lindsay vanished. His behavior unsettled her from the start. She recalled, "He looked out of place in the woods from the moment I saw him. I felt uneasy. I deliberately avoided his route, slowing down so that I could keep him in my sight. At one point, when I glanced back, he froze, as though startled by me looking at him. I didn't turn back again. I just hurried away. I never saw him after that." Her account placed a suspicious male in the exact area where Lindsay was last seen, though she couldn't make a formal identification. Her description matched the figure in the CCTV footage. By August 27th, police decided they had no choice but to release the video. They issued an urgent appeal for the public's help in identifying the man with the wheelie bin, the figure who might hold the key to Lindsay's murder. The footage quickly made national headlines. It showed a man, now treated as a suspect in the murder of mother-of-two Lindsay Burbeck, walking down Burnley Road towards Accrington at 2:30 on August 17th, 5 days after Lindsay vanished. Her body would later be discovered in a cemetery in Accrington that Saturday. Soon after the footage was released, Tim Stevens received a call from a friend who claimed he recognized the man. They had even gone to the same gym. That tip proved crucial. On the very same day, a mother and father walked into Greenbank Police Station with their teenage son. After Seeing the appeal that boy was just 16 years old, Draki Marciano Price, he was quickly taken into custody initially. A reporting ban shielded his identity, but that restriction was later lifted. A search of his home revealed chilling evidence, the same type of plastic used to wrap Lindsay's body, as well as the tracksuits seen in CCTV footage, even more damning. His DNA matched samples recovered from the cemetery, but who exactly was this teenage suspect? Price lived with his parents and 5 siblings on Winnie Hill Road. He had a low IQ of 65, struggled with learning difficulties, and was diagnosed with autism, and ADHD. Teachers at his specialist school described him as extremely quiet, often nonverbal, and only speaking about topics that interested him, such as the chickens he helped care for on his family farm. He spent his spare time at the gym, watching films, and playing video games. Psychologists, who had assessed him years earlier, concluded he had a limited understanding of emotions, poor awareness of danger, and required constant supervision outside the home. Police traced his movements on the day Lindsay died around 2:30 p.m. Price entered the coppice woodland. Lindsay followed roughly an hour and a half later. Within hours, Price was seen leaving his tracksuit half unzipped, waistband untied, and his knees wet. Investigators discovered he had returned to Lindsay's body multiple times on August 12 at 6:55 p.m. CCTV caught him carrying a black rucksack. Later, he returned with a wheelie bin. A witness recalled seeing him pulling it empty and rattling through the streets. Price revisited the gravesite 2 more times that same night. During 11 separate interviews across 3 days, his response to nearly every question was simply, "No comment." Later, he provided a prepared statement, claiming he had been approached by an unknown white male who offered him money to move the body. He insisted he didn't know the man, couldn't describe him, and had never been paid. Detectives scoured hours of CCTV footage, looking for this supposed accomplice, but found nothing. On August 31st, Price was formally charged with Lindsay's murder. Her grieving family, emotionally shattered, described themselves as completely and utterly numb at her funeral, held on September 20th at St. Margaret's Church. Over 200 mourners gathered. Her obituary captured the heartbreak. Lindsay was the most amazing mom. She doted on her children and always gave her all to ensure their lives were full of fun and laughter. Price's trial was scheduled for February 25, 2020, overseen by Justice Yip, but from the outset, problems plagued the case. Court delays, power failures, and even heating breakdowns. Then came a twist no one expected. Before the defense could even present their case, they applied for a retrial behind closed doors. Shocking details emerged. Police had arrested 3 unrelated individuals over a separate, false imprisonment case. On one of their phones was a disturbing video, apparently showing a man confessing to Lindsay's murder. The prosecution dismissed the video as inconsistent with the facts. Still, detectives launched an urgent investigation with 25 officers, only to confirm it was a false confession. Even so, the damage was done, the jury was discharged, and the trial collapsed. Price remained in custody as COVID lockdowns pushed the retrial back several more months. Finally, in August 2020, proceedings resumed. His story about an anonymous man paying him to move the body was rejected as implausible fiction. During the retrial, prosecutors carefully dismantled Price's version of events. They argued the teenager's mystery man did not exist, and the supposed payment was a desperate invention to deflect blame. The jury was told how Price's DNA had been found on key items at the cemetery, and how the CCTV trail followed his every movement from the woodland where Lindsay entered, to the wheelie bin dragged across the town, and finally to the graveyard where her body was dumped. Price never gave the court a convincing explanation. Instead, he continued to hide behind his repeated denials and the implausible story of a stranger who could never be found. After weeks of evidence, the jury reached their verdict, guilty of murder because of his age. The court was prevented from handing him a full life sentence, but Justice Yip delivered the harshest possible penalty available. Price was ordered to serve a minimum of 16 years in prison before being eligible for parole. He would be almost middle-aged before freedom could even be considered for Lindsay's family. The sentence was bittersweet. They expressed relief that justice had been done, but also sorrow that no punishment could bring her back outside the court. Her relatives released a statement. "We are relieved that the jury saw through the lies. Lindsay was a loving mother, daughter, sister, and friend. She will never be forgotten. And we as a family now ask for privacy as we try to rebuild our lives." The trial left many unanswered questions. Why had Price chosen Lindsay? What triggered the sudden and brutal violence in the Coppice woodland that summer afternoon? Experts suggested his cognitive difficulties and detachment from reality may have played a role, but ultimately, no clear motive ever emerged. One thing was certain: his actions had devastated an entire community. The sight of candlelit vigils, the outpouring of grief from friends and strangers, and the empty space left in the lives of Lindsay's children became the lasting reminder of a crime that should never have happened. In the aftermath, Lancashire police reflected on the extraordinary scale of the investigation. Hundreds of hours of CCTV combed through thousands of witness statements, collected forensic experts, tracing even blades of grass back to the crime scene. It was persistence, community cooperation, and one crucial CCTV clip of a blue wheelie bin that finally exposed the killer hiding in plain sight. Today, the case of Lindsay Birbeck stands as a chilling warning of how evil can lurk in the most unexpected places, even in the form of a quiet 16-year-old boy who appeared to live an ordinary life. Justice had been served, but the pain remained for Lindsay's family. There could never truly be closure.